Hey guys, welcome back to Election Center, and in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the widest possible margins of victory for the Democratic candidate Joe Biden and the Republican candidate Donald Trump on the 2020 electoral map. So basically, in this scenario, either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, we're going to be doing a scenario for both of them. For instance, Joe Biden wins every single state where he all has a possibility of winning, where it's not completely out of reach for him to win. So let me give an example here. He could technically win in a scenario where it's his widest possible margin of victory. I would give him the win in South Carolina, based on the way the voting groups break down here, and it's competitive enough where he could win the state of South Carolina if the roll of the dice was perfect for him. Same with Alaska, another one of these states where it's just competitive enough where if the roll of the dice was good enough and the way, the voters tend to break down here, he could pull off a victory in the state of Alaska. Uh, but yeah, now let's just jump into it, starting off with the Joe Biden sort of landslide scenario where he wins every single viable state. So yeah, filling in these safe states first. All these states where Donald Trump has absolutely no chance of winning. A lot of these states here in the Northeast, West Coast, Hawaii, Illinois will go to Joe Biden, and so yeah, this is for the most part the very very safe states for Joe Biden. Now getting into these more lean Joe Biden states that Donald Trump could technically maybe win, but they're probably just gonna go to Joe Biden, right? So yeah, New Mexico, Virginia. Now getting into the more of the battleground states here, like Ohio, Pennsylvania, the Rust Belt. So Joe Biden may have substantial leads in these states, but they're still battleground states. And then Texas and Georgia, southern states that have been historically more red, but are trending blue, and Joe Biden could very easily win. Oh, and Arizona, I guess Texas and Georgia and Arizona, they're battleground states nowadays, right? They've been trending blue to the point where nowadays it's no longer the case where the Republicans have, this enormous edge over the Democrats. Joe Biden could very well win these states. So now, okay, I'll fill in New Hampshire, all four of Maine's electoral votes, that second congressional district in Nebraska, Minnesota, and okay, now we're really getting into the more long shot states, starting off here in Alaska. Other than the presidential elections, in these other statewide races like the Senate election, gubernatorial election, Democrats fare a lot better and can actually win. But on the presidential level, voters tend to go more Republican, more heavily for the Republican Party. But if they were but that proves basically that there are a lot of voters that even if they vote Republican, they'd be willing to go Democratic. So if the Democrats played their cards right and also maybe just performed exceptionally well in the state of Alaska, they could pull off a victory here. And then Montana is a really similar situation where in a lot of statewide races, Democrats do a lot better than they do at the presidential level. Just the way the vote breaks down. But yeah, if the Democrats played their cards right, if the roll of the dice was in their favor, they could pull off a victory. It's not an impossibility. It's not out of reach. And in this widest possible margin scenario, they would end up winning Montana. And then moving on down here to the South. South Carolina, that could go to the Democrats. It's actually historically been kind of competitive in the 2000s, in recent elections. Republicans winning it by, on the heavier side of margins, but not totally out of reach for the Democrats. They get a respectable percentage of the vote, in the 40s range. So, and, if their key voting demographics, African Americans are in. They're a demographic that makes up a large percentage of the South Carolina population. That's one of the Democrats' key voting demographics. If there was high voter turnout among that demographic, and then maybe weaker voter turnout among some of these Republican demographics, white evangelicals, and then others, then Democrats could pull off a victory here. And it's competitive enough. If they also did exceptionally well, they could win here in South Carolina. Same with Mississippi, where it's a very similar situation to South Carolina in terms of how the vote breaks down and its level of competitiveness. Uh, these two states here, Louisiana and Arkansas, I feel like maybe you could make similar arguments, but they're more heavily Republican. They're not quite as competitive, and there's just not the data to back it up as much. We don't have any polling out of Louisiana so far, and then we just have one poll out of Arkansas. And while it did show just a 2 point spread, it's just that one poll. So, South Carolina and Mississippi have a lot more data to back up these claims that they could go blue. Just looking at the competitiveness in the polling. Arkansas and Louisiana, on top of being less competitive than Mississippi and South Carolina for the Democrats, there's just not as much data to back it up. So I can't, for now, put these as blue. So now I'm actually just going to fill in these states that, I just can't label as blue right now. These typical, really conservative states. And then I'm actually going to add Louisiana and Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. And Alabama for sure. And the rest of Nebraska. But now, the rest of these states, Iowa, I don't know why I didn't fill that in earlier. Yeah, this is Obama won this twice. It's definitely could go to the Democrats, even though it's center right, if you ask me. But yeah, Democrats could win here. And then these remaining states, Missouri and Indiana, there is the case to be made that they could go Democratic. And yeah, Democrats, if they really set their mind to it, they could win. Starting off with why they could win Missouri, the competitiveness in the margins is actually not as landslide territory for the Republicans as you might think. Democrats regularly score in the mid 40s. Now, it was a lot more of a landslide for the Republicans here in Missouri in 2016, where the margin was a lot wider than 2008 or 2012. I think Hillary Clinton was just a lot too hard to stomach for a lot of voters in Missouri. I think Hillary Clinton was just a lot harder to stomach for a lot of these voters. That corrupt image she had of being sort of a corrupt establishment type, really establishment Democrat politician. Too hard to stomach for a lot of the voters here in Missouri as well as other states. So we saw, in a lot of southern states, actually, the margin's unusually high for the Republicans, just because Hillary Clinton was too hard to stomach. That's my personal theory. But I think Joe Biden is going to be a lot easier to stomach, and I think he's going to return Missouri to its usual margins. It could go Democratic based on the competitiveness of the margins. It's actually just a 5 point spread. If you look at at least in the 538 polling averages in Missouri, Donald Trump has just over a 5 point lead in the state of Missouri, and it's not out of reach for Joe Biden. He could win Missouri. And then moving on to Indiana, it's not quite at the margin of totally safe Republican, and Obama won it in 2008. And if you look at the background of how Indiana votes, right, there's a group of voters in southern Indiana who have historically voted Democratic but are trending more and more red. I think just because Democrats have been getting a lot more socially liberal and Indiana is more socially conservative. So it's been trending more and more red. But it's proof that there are these voters who are willing to vote Democratic if they like the Democratic candidate. And Democrats, can win over the voters in Indiana. Obama won it in 2008. The margins, actually, once again, unusually large, or compared to some of the past elections, a lot larger in 2016. Hillary Clinton just really did poorly in a lot of these states, and Donald Trump did exceptionally well in some of these states. But yeah, Democrats have a capacity to win Indiana, is basically the point I am making here. Just a 10-point spread in the poll that came out from Indiana. That's a pretty big spread, but it's not totally insurmountable. So, Indiana, a bit of a stretch, but, this is, once again, the widest possible margin if Joe Biden won every viable state at all, every at all viable state. So there you guys have it. 455 electoral votes to 83 electoral votes. If Joe Biden wins every viable state, his widest possible margin. So let's count off the Republican states here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 states, minus that second congressional district in Nebraska. So yeah, that is the widest possible Democratic margin. And this doesn't just apply to Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. This is also more just thinking about hypothetical Democratic candidate versus a hypothetical Republican candidate. But of course, we are doing this about 2020. But now moving on to the Republicans with Donald Trump. Giving him every single safe state, and then we're also just going to give him that second congressional district in Nebraska because he's winning all the battlegrounds in this scenario, because a battleground inherently is possible to go to either party, either of the two major parties. So Arizona, Texas and Georgia trending blue, but they're slightly more on the conservative side, favored to go to the Republicans. And then these battleground states, Alaska, fill that in. Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Iowa. Ohio and Iowa a bit favored to the Republicans. A bit more Republican than Democrat, but still battleground states. And then they can win, of course, in the Rust Belt, Wisconsin and Michigan. And then Pennsylvania, Trump won in 2016. And now getting into these states that are a bit more of a stretch, but he could win, right? Minnesota, really close in 2016, less than 2 point spread, less than a 2 point margin of victory for Hillary Clinton. So yeah, he could win Minnesota. It's not out of reach, and if you look at the polling data, it's still viable for Donald Trump. New Hampshire, one of the closest states in 2016. It was a 0.37 margin. One of the closest states. I think maybe either Wisconsin or Michigan was a bit closer. But really insanely close, down to the wire here in 2016 in the state of New Hampshire. Not out of reach for Donald Trump, though. He could win New Hampshire. And if you look at the polling data, once again, in the viable territory, substantial lead for Joe Biden, but viable, right? Keyword being viable. And then all four of Maine's electoral votes, once again, viable for Donald Trump. He could technically win. Statewide, just a 3 point margin for Hillary Clinton, her margin of victory. But Donald Trump won that second congressional district. That swung sharply to the Republicans from, an 8 point margin for the Democrats in 2012, I believe, to a 10 point margin for the Republicans. That's a sharp swing, right? But all four of Maine's electoral votes viable for Donald Trump. Nevada should have filled that in earlier, right? I would consider this lean left, but it's still, just close enough to be battleground territory. If you look at the polling data, certainly viable. And looking at the margins, historical margins in recent elections, certainly viable. And Republicans have won the state in recent history, right? A lot of these states, Republicans have won in recent history. So totally not out of reach in this widest possible margin scenario. Same with Colorado and New Mexico, which we've seen get a lot more in favor to the Democrats. Democrats winning by heavier and heavier margins. Other than 2016, where the Democrats fell a lot in a lot of these states just because of Hillary Clinton's own weaknesses as a candidate and own weaknesses as a nominee for the Democratic Party. But not out of reach quite yet for the Republicans. New Mexico, we're really almost kind of stretching it, just because at this point I think a lot of people would consider it kind of a safe Democratic state. It's just not quite at that tier yet, though, if you ask me. Just looking at the polling data and historical margins, not out of reach for the Republicans. They could technically win it. And then Virginia, it's falling more and more out of the Republicans' grasp, like Colorado and New Mexico. It's been trending more and more to the left. Republicans losing their hold on Virginia, and Democrats really starting to do quite strongly here with quite heavy margins. Looking at the polling data, Joe Biden with like an 11-point lead here in Virginia, 10 points plus. That's a hefty margin, but it's not quite out of reach for the Republicans. And then let's just fill in some of these states where they can't win, even in this best-case, widest margin possible scenario. West Coast, Illinois, Hawaii, northeastern states. Interesting fact about Massachusetts, it does have a Republican governor, Charlie Baker, but he is a moderate Republican. He differs substantially from the national mainstream Republican Party and their type of ideology. He's a lot more socially liberal, Charlie Baker. He actually won his re-election bid 2/3 of the vote against the Democrats, 1/3. So that's really interesting, considering Massachusetts may be the most liberal Democratic state in the Union. But yeah, definitely out of someone like Donald Trump, definitely cannot win. And then at the presidential level, I just think a lot of voters will just not vote Republican. They will not vote in a Republican president. So yeah, definitely out of reach in Massachusetts. It's probably the most safely Democratic state. But it is an interesting, I guess it's just sort of an oddity that it does have that Republican governor. I guess because he's just so socially liberal compared to other Republicans. But then, Rhode Island, Connecticut, out of reach. New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, it is within reach. Republicans get, it's just competitive enough where it's probably one of the most, we're most stretching it out of all these states. But Delaware, I will give it to the Republicans in this best case, widest margin possible scenario where they win every viable state. Remember, keyword, viable. If Republicans, put a ton of money and time into Delaware, they could win it. I doubt they would. right? But they could win Delaware technically. Especially, maybe if they had higher turnout in the Republican areas, lower turnout in the Democratic areas. It's, in a dream scenario for Donald Trump, he would win the state of Delaware. And then D.C., that would go to Joe Biden, just because it's like almost 100% Democratic. If you look at the vote totals, it's like definitely like 0% chance for Donald Trump. But yeah, now finally the last state of Oregon. This is the last state that is viable for the Republicans to win. They could technically pull off a victory in Oregon. We're almost really stretching it here, but once again, this is a scenario where they win every possible viable state. So yeah, the state of Oregon, 7 electoral votes. There's a more Republican part of Oregon and a more Democratic part of Oregon, where the Democratic part tends to overpower the Republican part of Oregon. But maybe if we had imbalanced turnout and Republicans just doing exceptionally well in Oregon, they could win the state of Oregon. Yeah, the final electoral map, where Republicans win every viable state, every possible state, their widest possible margin, 366 electoral votes to 172 electoral votes. So yeah, let's count off the Democratic states here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 Democratic states plus DC, with Republicans winning the remaining 39. So yeah, 366 electoral votes for Trump, I guess, and then 172 for Biden. So yeah, that is the final. These are the final widest possible margins for the Democrats and Republicans. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and thought it was interesting. If you enjoyed this type of content that I make here on Election Center, the Election Center channel, electoral maps, polls, all things elections, really, right? I think you should definitely subscribe to my YouTube channel, because you're going to really enjoy the videos, that I've already made here on this channel, and you're going to really enjoy, I think, the videos that I will be making in the future. So I say it once again, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, thought it was interesting, and I will see you in the next Election Center video. Bye!